The alarm clock buzzed at 4:30 a.m., just like it had for the past 3 years. David rolled out of his small bed in the cramped studio apartment, his left leg stiff as always in the morning. The old injury acted up when the weather changed, but he'd learned to live with it. After a quick shower and instant coffee, he grabbed his keys and headed out into the cool California morning. The drive to the Naval Special Warfare Training Facility took 20 minutes through empty streets. David liked this time of day when the world was quiet, before the rush of people and noise that would fill the hours ahead. He'd park his beat-up Honda in the back lot, away from the fancy trucks and motorcycles that belonged to the Navy SEALs who trained here. Walking through the back entrance, David nodded to the security guard who barely looked up from his newspaper. Everyone knew him by now. He was just part of the background, like the vending machines or the motivational posters on the walls. That's exactly how he wanted it. His routine never changed. First, he'd unlock the janitor's closet and pull out his cart loaded with supplies. The smell of industrial cleaner and old mop water had become familiar, almost comforting. Then he'd make his rounds, starting with the locker rooms where yesterday's sweat and determination still hung in the air. The facility was massive, built to train some of the toughest soldiers in the world. There were multiple gyms, a pool complex, obstacle courses, and classrooms where future SEALs learned skills that could mean the difference between life and death. David had walked these halls thousands of times, mopping floors that would soon be covered in mud from training boots, wiping down equipment that would push human bodies to their limits. He moved quietly, almost like a ghost drifting through the building. His gray uniform was always clean and pressed, his thinning hair neatly combed. At 52, he looked like any other maintenance worker you might see in office buildings or schools across America. Nothing special, nothing that would make you look twice. The young SEALs would pass him in the hallways, some offering polite nods or quick good mornings. They were always respectful, these elite warriors. Their mothers had raised them right, and the military had reinforced those values. But David could see it in their eyes. He was invisible to them, just another civilian doing a job they considered beneath their notice. And that was fine by him. Better than fine, actually. David had perfected the art of being unremarkable. He kept his head down, spoke only when spoken to, and never lingered where conversations were happening. When the instructors gathered to discuss training schedules or upcoming missions, he'd quietly continue his work, becoming part of the furniture. When groups of trainees sat around sharing stories of their backgrounds or their dreams of special operations glory, David would empty nearby trash cans without making a sound. The one thing he couldn't hide completely was his habit of watching. Old habits die hard, and David's eyes were always moving, always scanning. He'd notice which recruits were struggling with the physical demands, which ones had the mental toughness to make it through the brutal selection process. He could spot the ones who would quit before they even knew it themselves. Sometimes late. At night, when the facility was empty except for security, David would find himself standing in the main training area where pull-up bars and rope climbs tested the limits of human endurance. The walls were covered with photos of SEAL teams from different eras, men who had served in jungles and deserts, in mountains and on foreign shores. Their faces looked back at him with the confidence that came from knowing they were among America's finest. David would stare at those photos for a long time before continuing his rounds. The physical demands of his job weren't challenging for him. Despite his limp, he'd learned to work around the old injury, compensating in ways that most people never noticed. The real challenge was the mental one: staying invisible, staying quiet, staying forgotten. Every day was an exercise in self-control, in being less than he had once been. His colleagues in the maintenance department were friendly enough. There was old Pete, who handled the groundskeeping, and Maria, who managed the supply orders. They'd invite David to join them for lunch sometimes, or coffee breaks in the small break room behind the main office. He'd make polite excuses, claiming he preferred to eat alone or that he had too much work to catch up on. The truth was simpler and more complicated than that. David had forgotten how to be around people in normal situations. Small talk felt foreign to him now. Questions about his past, even innocent ones about where he'd worked before or whether he had family, made him uncomfortable. It was easier to stay alone, to keep his distance from everyone, Even his apartment reflected this isolation. It was clean but sparse, with only the basics needed for survival. No photos on the walls, no personal mementos, nothing that would tell a story about who he was or where he'd come from. The most personal item he owned was an old radio that he'd listened to late at night, usually tuned to talk shows where other insomniacs called in to share their thoughts with strangers. The only time David felt truly at peace was during those early morning hours at the facility, before the controlled chaos of training began. He'd work methodically through his tasks, finding satisfaction in making things clean and orderly. There was something healing about taking a messy, used space and restoring it to perfect condition. It was one of the few things in his life that felt like progress. As the weeks and months passed, David had become part of the facility's rhythm. The SEALs would arrive for their morning PT, their voices echoing through the halls as they psyched themselves up for another day of pushing boundaries. The instructors would gather in their offices, planning exercises designed to break down and rebuild the human spirit. And through it all, David would move quietly in the background, maintaining the infrastructure that supported their mission. He dressed carefully each morning, making sure his long-sleeved gray shirt was buttoned properly at the collar. Even in the Southern California heat, he never rolled up his sleeves or loosened his collar. Some of his co-workers teased him about being formal, but David just smiled and changed the subject. The truth was that some things were better left covered. Some stories were better left untold, and some men were better off invisible even to themselves. David had found his rhythm in this life, had carved out a small space where he could exist without questions or complications. 3 years of the same routine had created a comfortable numbness, a sense that he could continue this way indefinitely. The past felt like something that had happened to someone else, in a different lifetime. But as any soldier knows, the most dangerous moment is when you think you're safe. Change has a way of finding you, even when you've done everything possible to disappear. And sometimes the thing that gives you away is something as simple as a piece of fabric riding up your arm at exactly the wrong moment, revealing secrets you thought were buried forever. David couldn't know it yet, but his carefully constructed invisible life was about to collide with the world he'd left behind. It was a Tuesday morning, and David was running his usual routine when everything changed. The main training hall had one of those flickering fluorescent lights that had been bothering everyone for weeks. Trainees would glance up at it during their workouts, squinting as it strobed on and off like a broken disco ball. Finally, someone had put in a work order to get it fixed. David wheeled his maintenance cart into the training area, grateful that it was still early enough to avoid the morning rush. The hall was empty except for some equipment that had been set up for later training sessions. Ropes hung from the ceiling, pull-up bars waited silently, and heavy bags swayed slightly in the air conditioning. This was his favorite time to work, in here, when the space felt calm instead of charged with the intensity that would fill it in a few hours. He positioned his stepladder under the problem light and climbed up carefully. His left leg always made him nervous on ladders, but he'd learned to compensate by taking his time and keeping 3 points of contact. The old injury didn't define him, but it definitely reminded him to be more careful than he used to be. As he reached up to unscrew the fluorescent tube, David had to stretch higher than usual. The light fixture was mounted just a bit too far from where he could safely position the ladder. He raised his arms above his head, focusing on getting a good grip on the plastic cover that protected the bulb. That's when his sleeve rode up. David was always careful about his clothing. Long sleeves, buttoned collars, everything in place. But when you're stretching to reach something overhead while trying to balance on a ladder, sometimes fabric shifts in ways you don't expect. His gray uniform shirt slid up his forearm just a few inches, exposing skin that he normally kept covered. Lieutenant Commander Jessica Torres had walked into the training hall to set up some equipment for her afternoon class. She was one of the senior instructors, a woman who'd fought hard to earn her place in the SEAL community and commanded respect from everyone around her. She'd seen enough military personnel to recognize certain things at a glance: the way someone carried themselves, the look in their eyes, the significance of various tattoos and markings. Jessica was arranging some training mats when she happened to look up at David on the ladder. At first, she was just making sure he was being safe. The facility took workplace safety seriously, and she didn't want to see anyone get hurt. But then she noticed something that made her stop what she was doing. There, on David's exposed forearm, was the edge of what looked like a tattoo. Not just any tattoo, but something with very specific markings that caught her attention immediately. She could see part of what appeared to be a trident symbol, and some numbers that looked like they might be coordinates or dates. The ink was old, faded the way military tattoos get after years of sun and time. But the design was still clear enough to recognize. Jessica had been around special operations long enough to know that certain tattoos told stories. They weren't just decorative art that someone had gotten on a weekend leave. They were markers of service, of units, of missions that most people would never hear about. And this particular combination of symbols was making her very curious about the quiet janitor she'd been ignoring for 3 years. David must have sensed someone watching him, because he glanced down and saw Jessica standing there with a strange expression on her face. For just a moment their eyes met, and she could have sworn she saw something flicker across his features. Not fear exactly, but definitely awareness. Like he knew exactly what she'd seen and what it might mean. Quickly, David adjusted his sleeve, pulling the fabric back down to cover his arm completely. He finished changing the light bulb with practiced efficiency, his movements now more controlled and deliberate. When he climbed down from the ladder, he kept his head down and began packing up his tools without making eye contact. "Thanks for fixing that," Jessica said, trying to keep her voice casual. That flickering was driving everyone crazy. "No problem, ma'am," David replied quietly, the same polite response he always gave. But Jessica noticed that his voice was steadier than she'd expected, not the nervous tone of someone who'd been caught doing something wrong. It was the voice of someone who was used to being in control, even in uncomfortable situations. She watched him fold up the stepladder and load it onto his cart. There was something about the way he moved now that seemed different from the shuffling, almost invisible janitor she'd grown accustomed to seeing around the facility. His movements were more precise, more economical, like muscle memory was kicking, and from somewhere deep in his past. Over the next few days, Jessica found herself paying attention to David in ways she never had before. She'd catch glimpses of him working in different parts of the facility, and study his behavior with the trained eye of someone who'd spent years evaluating people for their potential and their secrets. She noticed that despite his limp, David moved, with a kind of awareness that most civilian contractors didn't have. His eyes were always scanning, always checking corners and exits even when he was just mopping a floor. When groups of SEALs would walk past talking loudly, David would seem to fade into the background, but she could tell he was listening. Not in a nosy way, but with the kind of professional attention that someone might pay if they understood the significance of what was being discussed. During lunch breaks, when other maintenance workers would gather in the break room to eat and chat, David would disappear. Jessica made a point of walking past the areas where he might be, and she'd often find him sitting alone outside, eating a simple sandwich while staring out at the training fields where obstacle courses challenged the next generation of special operators. There was something about his posture during these quiet moments that intrigued her. He didn't sit like someone who was tired from manual labor. He sat like someone who was thinking, processing, remembering. His shoulders were straight despite the humble work clothes, and his hands rested in positions that seemed almost military, in their precision. Jessica began to wonder about David's background. The facility employed lots of former military personnel in various capacities, but most of them were pretty open about their service. They'd wear unit patches on their civilian clothes, or have military-themed bumper stickers on their cars, or share stories during coffee breaks about their time in different branches of service. David was different. He never mentioned any military experience, never joined in when conversations turned to deployments or training stories. He kept his personal life completely private, which wasn't unusual for a quiet person, but combined with that tattoo she'd glimpsed, it was starting to paint an interesting picture. The more she observed him, the more questions Jessica had. Where had that ink come from? What did those symbols mean? And why was a man who moved like he'd once been something more than a janitor now spending his days cleaning floors at a place where America's elite warriors trained. She found herself looking forward to seeing him during his rounds, hoping to catch another glimpse of whatever secrets he was keeping hidden under those long sleeves. But David had become even more careful than before, if that was possible. His uniform was always perfectly in place now, and he seemed to have developed an almost supernatural ability to avoid being in the same space as her for more than a few seconds. The game of cat and mouse had begun, though David probably didn't realize he was being studied. Jessica's curiosity was like a puzzle she couldn't stop trying to solve, and every small detail she noticed about the mysterious janitor just made her more determined to figure out who he really was. A week had passed since Jessica first noticed David's tattoo, and her curiosity had only grown stronger. She'd been watching him carefully, trying to piece together the puzzle of who this quiet janitor really was. But she wasn't prepared for what happened next. It was a Thursday afternoon when everything changed. The facility was hosting a special guest lecture by retired Master Chief Petty Officer Robert Hawk Mitchell, a legend in the SEAL community. Hawk was in his 60s now, with weathered skin that told stories of decades spent in harsh environments around the world. His gray beard was neatly trimmed, and despite his age, he still carried himself with the bearing of a warrior. Hawk had come to speak about survival techniques and mental resilience, topics that had kept him alive through missions that most people couldn't even imagine. The lecture was scheduled for the main conference room, and SEALs from different teams had gathered to hear wisdom from one of their most respected veterans. David was working in the hallway outside the conference room, slowly mopping the floors while trying to stay invisible as always. He could hear Hawk's voice through the open door, talking about the importance of adaptability in hostile environments. The old Master Chief had a way of speaking that commanded attention, his words carrying the weight of real experience. As the lecture ended, people began filing out of the room, chatting among themselves about the insights they'd gained. David kept his head down, focusing on his mop as groups of SEALs walked past him. This was always the most challenging part of his job, being around so many military personnel without letting his own background show through. Hawk was one of the last to leave the conference room, talking with a couple of instructors about upcoming training modifications. He was walking slowly, his eyes scanning the hallway in the automatic way that old soldiers never quite lose. That's when he saw David. At first, it was just a casual glance at the maintenance worker cleaning nearby, but something made Hawk look again, more carefully this time. There was something familiar about the way the janitor moved, despite the obvious limp, the posture, the way he held his shoulders, the careful awareness, even while doing mundane work. Hawk stopped walking and stared. The instructors he'd been talking with continued down the hallway, but the old Master Chief remained frozen in place, his eyes locked on David's profile. Slowly, recognition began to dawn on his weathered face. "It can't be," Hawk whispered to himself so quietly that no one else could hear. David must have sensed the intense scrutiny because he looked up from his mopping. For a moment, the two men's eyes met across the hallway. David's face went pale, and Hawk saw something in those eyes that confirmed his impossible suspicion. "Holy hell," Hawk breathed, his voice barely audible. "Phoenix." The mop clattered to the floor as David's hands went slack. The sound echoed in the now empty hallway like a gunshot. For several seconds, neither man moved, both frozen by the weight of recognition and all the memories it brought flooding back. Phoenix. It had been 15 years since anyone had called David by that name. 15 years since he'd been anything other than a quiet janitor trying to disappear into the background of normal life. But hearing it spoken aloud by someone who'd actually known him in that other life hit him like a physical blow. Hawk began, walking slowly toward David, each step deliberate and careful, like he was approaching a wild animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. His eyes never left David's face, searching for confirmation of what his mind was struggling to accept. "We got word that you were KIA, Hawk said quietly when he was close enough to speak without being overheard. "Afghanistan, 2009. IED attack on that convoy outside Kandahar. They said there were no survivors." David's throat felt like sandpaper. He hadn't spoken about that day to anyone, not in all the years since. The official report had declared him dead because it was easier than explaining what had really happened. Easier than dealing with the complicated truth of how he'd survived and what he'd endured afterward. There weren't supposed to be, David finally managed to say, his voice rusty from years of keeping secrets. Hawk's eyes were wide with disbelief and something that looked like grief mixed with joy. He'd mourned this man's death, had attended a memorial service where they'd honored an empty casket. To see him alive, working as a janitor in a place where Hawk had just been teaching the next generation of warriors, was almost too much to process. Jesus, Phoenix, what happened to you? Where have you been all these years? David glanced around nervously, making sure they were still alone in the hallway. The last thing he wanted was for their conversation to be overheard by any of the active duty personnel. His carefully constructed life of anonymity was crumbling by the second, and he wasn't sure he was ready for that. I can't. Not here, David said, picking up his mop with hands that weren't quite steady. Too many people around. But Hawk wasn't about to let this conversation end. He'd seen too many good men die over the years, had carried their memories, like stones in his chest. Finding out that one of them was still alive, still breathing, was like getting a piece of his soul back. The coffee shop on Orange Avenue, Hawk said quietly. Tomorrow morning, 0700. You owe me that much. David wanted to refuse, wanted to grab his cleaning supplies and disappear back into his safe, invisible existence. But looking at Hawk's face, seeing the mix of hope and pain in the old warrior's eyes, he found himself nodding. As Hawk walked away, David stood alone in the hallway with his mop and bucket, feeling like his whole world had just shifted off its axis. For 3 years, he'd managed to convince himself that his past was buried so deep that it could never surface. He'd created a new identity, a new life, a new way of existing that didn't require him to be anything more than a guy who cleaned floors. But the past has a way of finding you, no matter how well you think you've hidden from it. And now, standing in that hallway with the sound of his old call sign still echoing in his ears, David realized that the peace he'd built for himself was more fragile than he'd ever wanted to admit. That night, David lay in his small apartment staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Tomorrow's meeting with Hawk felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that whatever happened next would change everything. He'd spent so long being nobody that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be somebody, but Phoenix had been somebody once. Phoenix had mattered, had made a difference, had been part of something bigger than cleaning supplies and quiet mornings. The question was whether David was ready to remember what that felt like, or if some doors were better left closed forever. The alarm clock ticked loudly in the silence, counting down the hours until a conversation that would either set him free or destroy the only peace he'd known in 15 years. Either way, there was no going back now. Hawk had seen him, recognized him, spoken the name that connected him to a life he'd thought was dead and buried. Phoenix was about to rise from the ashes, whether David was ready or not. David barely slept that night. He kept staring at the ceiling of his small apartment, watching shadows move across the white paint as cars passed by outside. Every time he closed his eyes, memories came flooding back. Memories he'd spent years trying to forget. The sound of helicopters, the smell of desert sand, the weight of gear on his shoulders, and the explosion that had changed everything. At 6:30 a.m., he drove to the coffee shop on Orange Avenue with sweaty palms gripping the steering wheel. The place was a small local spot, the kind where retired military guys often gathered to share stories and stay connected to their brotherhood. David had always avoided places like this, but now he had no choice. Hawk was already there when David walked in, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups of black coffee. The old Master Chief looked like he hadn't slept much either. His eyes were red-rimmed but alert, watching David with the intensity of someone who'd been waiting for answers for 15 years. "Phoenix," Hawk said quietly as David sat down across from him. "Or do you go by David now?" "Just David," he replied, wrapping his hands around the warm coffee cup. "David Chen. That's who I've been for the past decade." Hawk leaned back in his chair, studying David's face like he was trying to reconcile the man in front of him with the memory of the soldier he'd once known. "You look different. Older, obviously. But there's something else. You look broken down. David almost smiled at that. That's what happens when you get blown up and spend 2 years as a guest of some very unfriendly people. The coffee shop was quiet around them, just the soft murmur of morning customers and the hiss of the espresso machine. But between the two, men at the corner table, the weight of unspoken history filled the air like smoke. "We need to start from the beginning," Hawk said. "The convoy. What really happened out there?" David took a long sip of coffee, buying himself time. He'd never told this story to anyone, not completely. The military psychiatrists had tried to get it out of him during his brief return to the States, but he'd given them just enough to satisfy their reports and nothing more. "The IED hit the second vehicle," David began slowly. "I was in the lead truck, survived the initial blast, but there were shooters waiting in the rocks. It was a perfect ambush, planned down to the minute." Hawk nodded grimly. Ambushes like that had claimed too many good soldiers over the years. I took shrapnel in my leg, but I could still move. 3 other guys made it out of the vehicles alive, but they were in bad shape. I tried to set up a defensive perimeter, call for backup, do everything by the book. David's hands tightened around his coffee cup. But there were too many of them, and they knew exactly what they were doing. "The report said there were no survivors," Hawk prompted gently, "because there weren't supposed to be. They took me and left everyone else for dead, dragged me into the mountains, kept me in a cave system that probably dated back to Alexander the Great." David's voice had gone flat, emotionless. 2 years, 3 months, and 16 days. Hawk felt his blood run cold. He'd been captured himself, once briefly during a mission in Central America back in the 80s. 3 days of hell that still gave him nightmares. He couldn't imagine 2 years. "How did you get out?" "Patience and luck. I learned their language, gained some trust, studied their routines. One night during a sandstorm, I killed 2 guards and walked out into the desert. Took me 6 days to reach a village where someone could contact American forces. And then?" David was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee like it held answers he'd been looking for. "Then I spent 8 months in military hospitals. Physical therapy for my leg, psychological evaluation, debriefings that went on for weeks. They wanted to understand what I'd learned about enemy tactics, what intelligence I could provide." "But you didn't go back to active duty." "I couldn't." David's voice cracked slightly. 2 years in that cave changed me, Hawk. I couldn't handle crowds, couldn't sleep without nightmares, couldn't trust anyone. The doctor said I had severe PTSD, but it was more than that. I'd forgotten how to be around people. Hawk had seen it before, the invisible wounds that some soldiers carried home from war. The lucky ones found ways to heal, to reconnect with the world. Others never quite made it all the way back. "So they let you disappear?" "Officially, Phoenix died in that convoy. The military agreed to let me start over with a new identity, a clean slate. No records, no history, no connections to my old life. It was easier for everyone that way." "And you became a janitor." David managed a bitter smile. "Funny how life works out, isn't it? I went from being one of the most highly trained soldiers in the world to mopping floors. But you know what? It was exactly what I needed. No pressure, no life or death decisions, no one depending on me for anything more than keeping the place clean." They sat in silence for a while, both men lost in their own thoughts. Around them, the coffee shop was filling up with the morning rush, but their corner table felt isolated from the normal world. "The tattoo," Hawk said finally. "Jessica saw it, didn't she?" David nodded. "Smart woman. I got careless changing a light bulb. Let my sleeve right up. She's been watching me ever since, trying to figure out what she saw. She's going to ask questions. So are others, now that I've seen you. The SEAL community isn't that big, David. Word travels fast." "I know." David rubbed his forehead, feeling a headache building behind his eyes. "I've been dreading this day for 3 years. Part of me always knew it would happen eventually." Hawk leaned forward, his voice becoming more urgent. "Listen to me. You were one of the best operators I ever worked with. What you went through, what you survived, that takes a special kind of strength. Maybe it's time to stop hiding from who you are." "Oh no, who I was," David corrected. "That person doesn't exist anymore." "Bullshit." Hawk's voice carried the authority of someone who'd seen soldiers at their worst and their best. "I've been watching you for 20 minutes and I can see Phoenix right there under the surface. The way you sit, the way your eyes track movement around the room, the way you position yourself with your back to the wall. You can change your name and your job, but you can't change what's in your bones." David wanted to argue, wanted to insist that he really had left his old life behind. But deep down, he knew Hawk was right. Even as a janitor, even in his quiet, invisible existence, he was still the same person who'd survived 2 years in hell and walked out of a desert to tell about it. "What do you want from me, Hawk?" "I want you to remember that you matter, that what you did, what you sacrificed means something. And I want you to know that if you ever decide to stop running from yourself, you've got people who will support you." The offer hung in the air between them like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. David could feel something stirring inside him, something he'd buried so deep he'd almost forgotten it existed. Hope, maybe. Or just the memory of what it felt like to be part of something bigger than himself. But accepting help meant accepting who he really was. And David wasn't sure he was ready for that kind of courage yet. Word traveled fast through the SEAL community just like Hawk had predicted. By Monday morning, David could feel the change in the air at the facility. People were looking at him differently. Not with the casual indifference he'd grown used to, but with curiosity, respect, and something that made him deeply uncomfortable: recognition. Jessica was the first to approach him directly. She found him in the equipment storage room, organizing cleaning supplies with the methodical precision that had become his trademark. When she cleared her throat behind him, David turned around slowly, already knowing what this conversation would be about. "We need to talk," she said simply. David nodded, setting down the bottle of floor cleaner he'd been holding. "I figured this moment would come eventually." They walked to an empty classroom where Jessica closed the door behind them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Jessica studied his face, seeing past the janitor's uniform to something deeper underneath. "Hawk told me who you are," she said finally. "Who you were, I mean. Phoenix." "That name doesn't belong to me anymore," David replied quietly. "Maybe not, but the man who earned it is still standing right here." Jessica leaned against the desk, her arms crossed. "Do you know what we found when we looked into your service record? Most of it's classified so black that even I can't access it. But the parts we could see, Jesus, David, you were a legend." David felt uncomfortable with the praise. He'd spent 3 years learning to be invisible, to be unremarkable. Having someone talk about his past achievements felt like wearing clothes that no longer fit. "That was a different person in a different time," he said. "Was it?" "Because I've been watching you work for 3 years, and I've seen things that make a lot more sense now. The way you move through this facility like you understand every inch of it. How you notice everything that's happening around you, even when you're pretending not to. The respect you show for the training equipment, like you know what it's really for." Before David could respond, there was a knock on the door. Commander Jake Rodriguez entered, followed by 2 other senior officers. David recognized them all. They were the people who ran this facility, who shaped the training that produced America's elite warriors. "Mr. Chen," Commander Rodriguez said, using David's assumed name with careful respect. "We'd like to speak with you if you have a few minutes." David wanted to say no, wanted to grab his cleaning cart and disappear back into the safety of his routine. But he could see in their faces that this wasn't really a request. His secret was out, and there was no putting it back in the bottle. They moved to a larger conference room, the same one where Hawk had given his lecture just days earlier. David found himself sitting at a table surrounded by officers who normally wouldn't give a janitor a second glance. The irony wasn't lost on him. "We've been doing some research," Commander Rodriguez began. "What we've learned about your service record is impressive doesn't begin to cover it. You were involved in operations that are still classified at the highest levels." "I was just doing my job," David said, the standard response he'd always given when people tried to make him sound like more than he was. "Your job included missions that most people couldn't survive, let alone succeed at," Jessica added. "You saved lives, completed objectives that others had failed at, spent 2 years in enemy captivity, and still managed to escape. David felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever people talked about his military service. The praise, the hero worship, it all felt wrong to him. He knew what he'd done, but he also knew what it had cost him. The nightmares, the isolation, the inability to connect with normal life. Heroes in movies got parades and happy endings. Real heroes often got PTSD and a lifetime of trying to forget. "We have a proposition for you," Commander Rodriguez continued. "We'd like you to consider coming out of retirement, so to speak. Not for active duty, we understand that's not an option. But as a consultant and instructor, you could share your knowledge with the next generation of SEALs." The offer hung in the air like a challenge. David could see the hope in their faces, the expectation that he'd jump at the chance to reclaim his former glory. They didn't understand that glory wasn't what he'd been looking for when he became a janitor. "You could make a real difference here," Jessica added. "These young operators, they need to learn from someone who's actually been through what they're training for. Someone who survived the worst and lived to tell about it." David looked around the table at their eager faces. Good people, all of them, dedicated to a mission he'd once believed in with everything he had. But that belief had been tested in a cave in Afghanistan, broken down over 2 years of darkness and pain, and the constant knowledge that he might never see home again. "I appreciate the offer," David said slowly. "I really do. But I think you're misunderstanding something fundamental here." He stood up from his chair, feeling suddenly restless. Walking to the window, he looked out at the training fields where young SEALs were pushing themselves to their limits, chasing dreams of becoming part of something elite and special. "You see a hero who's been hiding his light under a bushel," David continued. "Someone who should be inspiring the next generation with tales of courage and sacrifice. But that's not who I am anymore." He turned back to face them, and for the first time in 3 years, David let them see something real in his eyes. Not the quiet janitor, not the broken veteran, but the person he'd become through years of healing and self-discovery. "I found something in this job that I'd been looking for my whole life without realizing it," he said. "Peace. Not the peace you get from winning battles or completing missions, but the peace that comes from knowing exactly who you are and being okay with it." Commander Rodriguez looked confused. "But your talents, your experience, surely you feel an obligation to share that with others?" David smiled, and it was the first genuine smile any of them had seen from him. "I do share it. Every day. When I keep this facility clean and safe, I'm supporting your mission. When I make sure the training equipment is properly maintained, I'm contributing to the readiness of every SEAL who uses it. When I show up early and stay late to make sure everything is perfect, I'm serving my country just as much as I ever did in uniform." The room was quiet as they absorbed what he was saying. They'd expected him to jump at the chance to return to glory, to reclaim his place among the elite. Instead, he was choosing to remain exactly where he was. "But don't you miss it?" Jessica asked. "The brotherhood, the mission, the feeling of being part of something important?" David considered the question seriously. "I miss parts of it, sure. But I've learned something important over the past 3 years. There are different kinds of courage. There's the courage to charge into battle, and there's the courage to walk away from battle. There's the courage to be a hero, and there's the courage to be ordinary." He picked up his keys from the table, the simple key ring that opened supply closets and equipment rooms instead of classified facilities and secure compounds. "I've been extraordinary," David said. "I've had people call me a hero, a legend, someone special. And you know what I discovered? Being ordinary is harder. It takes more strength to get up every morning and do simple work well than it does to get pumped up for a dangerous mission. It takes more courage to find meaning in small things than in grand gestures." Commander Rodriguez made one last attempt. "We could arrange for you to work part-time, keep your current position, but add some consulting duties. Best of both worlds." David shook his head gently. "Sir, with all due respect, you're still not hearing me. This isn't about finding a compromise between my old life and my new one. This is about choosing the life that makes me whole." He headed toward the door, then paused and turned back to them. "Phoenix was a good soldier," he said. "But David Chen is a better man. And right now, this facility needs David Chen to make sure the floors are clean and the equipment works and the small details are taken care of so that you can focus on the big picture." As he walked out of the conference room and back toward his janitor's cart, David felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Not peace, he'd found that already. This was something deeper. This was the satisfaction of knowing exactly who he was and having the courage to be that person, regardless of what anyone else thought he should be. Behind him, the officers sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. They'd expected to recruit a hero. Instead, they'd learned a lesson about the different forms that heroism could take. David pushed his cart down the hallway, his limp barely noticeable after 3 years of practice. Tomorrow would bring another early morning, another day of quiet work, another opportunity to find meaning in the simple act of taking care of the place where heroes were made. And for the first time since that explosion changed his life 15 years ago, David Chen was exactly where he belonged.